Since the dawn of time, man has created images perpendicular to the landscape, forms that reach from earth to sky. They have been admired, worshipped, and respected. Throughout history, there have been periods when society has been more supportive of the creation of these forms and images and of their creators. Even today, the emphasis on sculpture and respect for the artist varies from country to country. Why is this so? Although creating a sculpture for a particular site has often been an event, we are now at a point where the general public is seemingly apathetic to such events. It is a major endeavor to create a public sculpture. Creative talent, financial and moral support, as well as endless hours, are the backbone of such a project. It takes the dedicated commitment of a few individuals to see it through. That is just what has happened in a small town in North Dakota.
I see that this particular town and most of eastern North Dakota is very, very flat, and it lends itself well. It's almost like a natural sculpture garden. And I've seen the need for the space to be broken up, and preferably by sculpture.
Robert Michael Smith is a sculptor and professor of visual arts at the University of North Dakota. Since the early spring of 1987, Smith has had the opportunity to work on a piece for this natural sculpture garden, a piece that was commissioned by the city of Grand Forks. But the story is much more complicated than that. It's a story of public apathy, of insufficient financing, of the business of public art. A story of some progressive city officials and private citizens trying to make their corner of the world more beautiful. Of a creative artist looking for opportunities, support, and recognition for his efforts. It's a story that began with a desire by the Grand Forks Park Board for some form of public art that would make a positive statement about the city and its people.
I think that art is becoming a more important aspect of improving the atmosphere in a park. I think that it's an appropriate place for it. The board is looking at this as a first of several artworks that could be located throughout the parks, as sculpture, other items in the parks.
And myself and John Staley, the city forester, who's been doing all the landscaping in University Park, put together a pad that would be attractive, and it would be something we could do in the future, because that's that's a very focal point in our park system, University Avenue, in that park. So it has been sitting there for 3 years, and the president of our board said either put something on it or get rid of it.
And I believe they proceeded then with a $500 contract, I believe, to do a proposal, which bought them basically a full outline of the time schedule, a price tag for the completed work, and also a small-scale model.
Eventually, the Park Board and the Grand Forks Arts and Humanities Council commissioned Smith for $15,000. Before the piece was completed, Smith would invest another $4,000 of his own money.
Ultimately, I think what really sold this whole thing was the fact that it was such a deal that for somewhere between $10,000 or $15,000, they were ultimately going to get a product worth 5 times that.
Certainly the price that they're getting this thing for isn't, they're getting a bargain, a real bargain, because he's not getting paid for this. He built nothing into it for himself. He simply is doing it for the cost of the materials and to pay some labor for people that work for him.
I would not do this again. This for me was a one-time sort of pro bono sort of activity, and I will never work this hard for nothing or for little again in my life.
Before funding was granted, Smith had to submit a maquette, a model of the piece, to the Park Board for approval. Although he was the only artist considered for the project, the fact that this was to be a public sculpture made it imperative that Smith's ideas be debated by all the involved parties. It was difficult to please everyone.
Public sculpture is so tricky. It is a very difficult thing to do because you're playing into everybody's preconceptions about what a work of art, a public work of art, is supposed to be and what it's supposed to do.
It's interesting on a sculpture. Everybody has a different interpretation of whether it's right or wrong, or it fits the setting, or it fits what you're trying to do from the, is a sculpture representing their interpretation of what you're trying to interpret, or however you want to word it from that standpoint.
We took this and we've advertised it in the paper. It was put out in the paper. We've had it on display. We've encouraged people to come in and give their comments. In fact, it was on the front page of the paper once, and we did get the comments. But I don't think we were so concerned about whether they liked it. It was interesting because people would like certain things in the sculpture, and it's very difficult to look at a model and to see exactly what it's going to look like. And that was encouraging. At least they didn't say, hey, you know, you shouldn't be spending $5,000 building this, although we did hear some of that.
Nothing like this is going to be universally popular. And probably the more adventurous you get with the project, the less popular it will be. But I like the process, and I think giving the artistic freedom to the artist and not tying them down to a lot of details of exactly what images they expect to see in the final product. They gave almost full freedom for the sculptor to come up with a proposal.
I feel that the images I've chosen are significant because they are the images, the objects that we see and deal with more than anything else. In this area, Grand Forks relies heavily on its agricultural industry. It relies heavily on the air base, SAC base just outside of town, and the university is a very prominent feature here. So those three elements make up what I consider the main focal points of Grand Forks, and so a lot of the images relate to that. Also, as I said earlier, the importance of transportation in terms of cars and trains and planes is very obvious and prominent here. The missiles at the bottom relate strongly to the silos that exist in this area, and this particular area is the heaviest concentration of below-ground missile silos than any other part of the country. I think that it could be interpreted many ways. I think that if it's controversial, it's only that the symbols that it represents themselves are controversial. I'm not making a statement one way or the other about missiles in silos in North Dakota, nor am I making statements necessarily about B-1 bombers at the Grand Forks Air Force Base. But the very fact that they are present there, and they are just as prominent as potatoes and sugar beets and fish and cars and trains, sets up a question. And that question is really up to the viewer to answer for themselves. One can say that I might be raising a question of whether it's right or wrong, but I'm not necessarily raising that question. And in essence, it functions as a time capsule above ground. That it is made of a material that can last thousands of years, and it could stand there theoretically while the environment and the urban existence around it changes continually. And at some point, say conceivably 100 or a couple hundred years from now, a spectator looking at that piece would have a much different perception of what it's about than, say, someone who sees it today.
Because the sculpture was conceived as a historical perspective of Grand Forks and the Red River Valley, its story would be told through many different images that began in molds. These molds are created from actual objects or representative models. Obtaining these materials presented yet another problem for Smith, a problem solved by donations.
We still use poles in Grand Forks. The cross arm was a little different story because we don't have any aerial wire. Northwestern Bell has replaced all of our aerial wire about 6 years ago. We had a little trouble locating a cross arm. We ended up, we brought one, we were able to find one at Thief River Falls, and I brought it in, and when Robert came in to look at it, it was too small. And then we had another search go on, and we located one up at Grafton, and brought that in, and it was the right size.
Well, I think the fact that it's his statement about the area is more important to me than the fact that they came from Red River. But we are pleased to have been a part of it.
Robert Smith called me up and asked me if we would donate a tie and a train set, and I was liaison man between our main headquarters in St. Paul and Bob. We thought it was well worthwhile the time and effort. We feel that the statue is going to be there for a long time, and a lot of people are going to see it.
We do use a lot of it. We, of course, the hides and the heads. What we don't sell for mounted heads, we sell the skulls, we sell the horn shells, and once in a while some jaw bones or some feet, leg bones, and the front part of the leg, we get $10 a piece for them when we save them whole, and there's quite a demand for them. The Indians use them for a tool and for a canoe paddle, and now I guess they're used mainly for painting and decorations and things like that. They claim the buffalo were America's oldest inhabitant, so we owe the buffalo quite a bit actually. They're far superior to our American cattle as far as eating and living. They were made for this country, and I think we owe them that respect.
Art is often viewed as one of the last things necessary to fund. And in a time when funding is very difficult to get, and there's a general attitude of cutting back everywhere, unfortunately culture is the first victim. It's the first thing to get cut across the board. I was approached by the City Park Board, so fortunately they came in with the idea that they were going to spend some money. I did not have to go to them for that. That made my job a lot easier. But then I was in a position of having to convince the public that this was money well spent.
With funding in place and donations in hand, Smith and his assistants began the many processes necessary to create the sculpture. Processes that would require many different types of materials, such as sand, latex, and plaster. With these materials, Smith patiently and tediously began the delicate work of forming and shaping the piece, work that would take more than a year to complete.
I wanted to move my own work into the monumental scale. I wanted to make my work, I wanted to move it into the public sculpture area as an expansion of my own career. And this was an opportunity to do that. It was also an opportunity to help develop an interest in sculpture in my own program here at the university and in relationship to the city. I would not be able to even do a lot of this because of the physical nature of it. It just takes a lot of people, it takes a lot of hands and a lot of muscles lifting and moving things. Several of the processes just take several people to physically carry them out. Besides that, when I was living in Italy, in an area where there's a lot of production of sculpture going on by generations of artigiani, their attitude is that they see themselves as musicians to a composer, that the composer is the artist who creates the music and they just carry it out. And I see that that relationship is very similar to a sculptor working with his assistants. In my case, I happen to be also very much involved in the process, and in many cases I'm teaching the process to my assistants.
I have been working, you know, for all kinds of companies, for banks and for whatever, and I was just making a break into the commercial art world in London. And then I thought, well, you know, stuff that, forget it. I'm going to leave and go and do something totally different. People did say, why, you know, why are you going to North Dakota? And well, this is the only contact I had to work on a reasonable, you know, sized piece. I know enough artists and enough foundries in England to carry on working with them, but then, you know, you don't get anywhere unless you take any risks. And this is, I don't know any people working on a project this size.
Basically, it's the first summer I've ever had a chance to, you know, make art without, you know, wanting to work or, you know, get in a factory job or something like that. So, and, you know, a lot of good experience.
The steps are rather complicated and involved. That they involve, first of all, starting off with an original pattern. Now that can be an original piece of artwork or it can be an object. And if that object is in wax, then you go ahead with the casting stages. If it's not, you have to make a mold. The idea of making a mold is to make a wax. This entire process is called cire perdu, which is French for lost wax. And it's a process that goes back 5,000 years. When you finally have what you want in bronze, you have to make sure it's all in wax first. The process is basically the same as it's been for 5,000 years. We have better equipment, we have better materials, we have a little bit better knowledge, but the steps are almost the same. Once you have a wax pattern, then you can do work to it, you can clean it up, you can weld other waxes together, you can build things in wax. Then you make a second mold, which is called an investment mold. And it's a mold made out of refractory materials. Refractory meaning that it's materials that withstand high temperatures. Now there are several different types of investment molds, and we're using most of them in this process. There are sand molds. There are standard investment molds, which is a mixture of water, plaster, and sand. And there is ceramic shell. Now there are also channels of wax which are added, which are called sprue systems, and that's basically the system by which when this investment mold is done, it's placed in a kiln, the wax is melted out. Well, you have to have a way for it to get out of the mold. So you have these channels which direct the wax out of the mold to exit it. Also later, it's the way that the molten metal gets into the mold. Right? So that's called a spruing or a gating system. Occasionally we'll bring in a couple of undergraduate students to help us when we're actually casting. If we're casting some larger pieces, then we might need 5 people total. After you've had your wax pattern gated up, invested, placed in a kiln for a burnout, it's taken out and metal is molten, then poured into the mold. That's allowed to cool. That investment mold is completely broken apart, so sort of a one-time mold. It's wasted. What you have left is a raw casting, and all those channels are now also in metal too, so you have to first of all cut all those channels off, and you can save that metal to remelt for another time. And then you do whatever's necessary to that raw casting to finish it. Now that can mean grinding, welding, polishing, any number of things.
Once all the major pieces had been welded together, the sculpture was moved outdoors to be sandblasted. After many delays, this somewhat forgotten work of art was finally moved to its pad. At the official dedication later, a sparse group of curious onlookers reacted to the finished piece.
Just didn't look like much from the front when you drive by it. I guess I didn't realize this was on the back side of it until I just come over here and looked at it, you know. Looks like a lot of work involved in it. So, and I think it'll probably look better. I think he's got to buff it out or something, somebody was saying.
I think it's. I think it's something that's really easy to understand when you look at it, and you can really tell it. Just like if you're a tourist or something, you can really tell it.
The first thing comes to my mind, well, with the next appropriation, maybe some steps can be put on that side of this terracotta slab, and then the sidewalk built off.
I see the fish, which I guess is part of the river and the atmosphere of the whole area. The potatoes, the grains, and I like this touch. I like the touch of the what have you?
Aircraft?
No, the skull. I like the touch of that because that to me certainly depicts the area, you know. I like it. I really do, and I'm not usually one who is very fond of modern things.
It's just like he went out in the field and picked all those sunflowers and stuff. It's really neat. I love it. It's like a heritage or something.
How much the initial public reaction to this artwork will affect future works is unknown. If the piece is not readily accepted by the citizens of Grand Forks, the city may abandon future projects, or positive reaction may set the stage for bigger, more ambitious projects.
I think what we're looking at is developing that if this can happen, and if it turns out to be a good project, maybe some of the other the city of Grand Forks or the university, or there may be more works of art placed in public places. We're going to be the start.
The board is looking at this as the first of several artworks that could be located throughout the parks, that is sculpture, other items in the park.
I think it's a great idea, especially if it represents the growth of Grand Forks and the history of Grand Forks.
A couple of people there have big dreams of this being a continuing thing. And I would hope that some of the things that could come from it would actually be artists submitting proposals to the park district rather than having to go through a selection process. That it would be people seeing this kind of thing in the parks or in any public building or property and asking to become a part of it.
Ultimately, I think the success will be measured in its acceptance by the people of this town. It is not unusual for works of art, especially on the public level, to be unaccepted by some people at first. Some people get very vehement and try to have it removed. But many times some of the most controversial pieces have then been embraced by the general people and have been used as a symbol. It becomes a landmark. And I think that Grand Forks is one of those sort of small Midwest cities that really is in need of some very visual, cultural landmarks.
Today, public art is controversial at best. Financing is difficult, and public support may be less than adequate. But if acceptance of public art is cyclical, then perhaps appreciation and respect for art and the artist is in our future. This could lead to a resurgence, a renaissance in the art world in this country. History has taught us that such periods are visually and emotionally breathtaking. Perhaps then, this corner of University Park in Grand Forks, North Dakota, will truly become an intimate space for all who enter.